No one in Washington expected what happened next, not even Melania Trump. She had assumed her call would remain private, a brief moment stolen during recess. But as her quiet voice filtered through the live microphones of the Rayburn House office building, the silence in the nearly empty chamber sharpened into something electric. Representative Jasmine Crockett, already seated and reviewing her notes, looked up in disbelief as Melania's unmistakable accent echoed off the polished wood panels. It wasn't meant to be public. That's what made it dangerous. The hearing room, like most places in D.C., exuded an aura of restrained formality. The air was cool, overcooled, deliberately so, to keep minds alert and tempers in check. Afternoon sun glinted through tall windows, casting sharp beams across the floor, illuminating the witness table that had hosted Melania just an hour earlier. Her belongings remained, a designer bag resting casually beside a monogrammed leather folio and a water glass stained with rose-colored lipstick. Traces of control, traces of someone trying not to be seen too clearly. Jasmine had come back early from the break. She always did. Preparation was her armor. Color-coded tabs, annotated briefs, organized cross-references. Her navy blazer fit like intention. Her heels made no sound on the carpet as she crossed to her seat. She'd planned to spend these few minutes re-reviewing family welfare statistics, ones that made clear how children raised in political households experienced increased mental health risks. But then Melania's voice cut through the quiet. "Barron, can you hear me?" Jasmine froze. There was a pause, and then a quieter, almost trembling whisper. "Thank you for answering this time." The freshman congresswoman from Texas recognized instantly that she was hearing something deeply personal, something not meant for her ears. Her first instinct was to stand, to alert Melania, to retreat. But the tone of the former First Lady's voice, so unlike the cool, practiced testimony she had given earlier, stopped Jasmine in place. It was a voice filled not with polish but with pain. "You need to come home," Melania pleaded, her accent thickening with emotion. "This isn't good for you, for any of us." Behind her courtroom-trained composure, Jasmine's thoughts raced. She'd seen it before. Mothers trying to protect children while caught in machinery that didn't care. And here it was again, laid bare by a technical oversight. One of the microphones hadn't been muted during recess, and now the world, or at least those present, could hear Melania Trump trying to bring her son back from a place of emotional distance. "It's been 2 weeks," Melania continued, her voice growing more urgent. "You know how he gets when things don't go his way. No names, no need." Jasmine knew exactly who he was. The entire country did. Melania paused again, listening to the other end of the call. Then she whispered, "I know you're upset. I don't blame you. But staying with your aunt can't be forever." As she spoke, her posture sagged slightly. Her public mask slipped. Not entirely, but enough for Jasmine to see past it. Her shoulders, once squared in defiance and elegance, now curled inward, as if trying to shield herself from a blow. She wasn't testifying anymore, she was just a mother, scared and trying. "The doctors are concerned," Melania whispered next. "Dr. Levinson said the stress levels are not normal. Are the sleep problems back again?" That name. Jasmine recognized it instantly. Howard Levinson was not just any doctor. He was among the most sought-after adolescent psychiatrists in the country. His involvement suggested something far more serious than what had been offered to the public. Jasmine's memory jumped to the statement the Trump spokesperson had released the week before. Barron's absence was due to educational obligations. But this wasn't about school. This was about survival. "I know you feel safe where you are," Melania said, voice straining against the rising tide of tears. "But we can't let this go on. People are asking questions. The press has noticed." There it was again. The dual pressure of private pain and public scrutiny. Jasmine could feel it, the familiar war between protection and performance. "I miss you," Melania said, and the room, though technically empty, felt like it was holding its breath. "It doesn't feel like home without you." Jasmine sat, frozen. A small part of her wanted to shut her eyes to block out the rawness of it. She'd heard desperate parents before, but this one came with the weight of national consequence. Then came the sentence that struck Jasmine like a blow. "I promise I'll protect you this time." This time. The implications wrapped themselves around Jasmine's ribs like vines. What had happened before? What had Melania failed to prevent? Jasmine stood then, not out of curiosity, but duty. She made just enough noise to announce herself, gently, not wanting to startle. Melania looked up. Her face registered shock, confusion, and then horror. Jasmine met her eyes. Calmly, clearly, she said, "Your microphone is on." The air between them thickened with unspoken understanding. Melania fumbled to end the call. "I'll call you back," she muttered into the phone before disconnecting. She rose with practiced elegance, smoothing her skirt. But the tremor in her hand betrayed her. For a moment, they simply looked at one another, two women from vastly different worlds, caught in an unexpected intersection of truth. Jasmine could have turned that moment into political capital. The media would have salivated. But instead, she said softly, "A home should be a sanctuary, not a prison." And in Melania's eyes, Jasmine saw it. Not gratitude, not exactly, but relief. A moment of understanding passed between them. Then Melania said, "You have no idea what it's like." Jasmine responded without hesitation. "I defended families in crisis for 15 years before I ever stepped into Congress. I do know." Melania looked away, then back again, testing Jasmine's sincerity. "And you'll use this moment against us?" Jasmine shook her head once. "That would only hurt your son." Before Melania could speak again, the chamber doors swung open. The other committee members were back. The moment was gone. But something had changed. As the committee reconvened, the air in the room shifted. There was a new undercurrent, almost imperceptible to most, but Jasmine Crockett felt it like a pulse beneath the surface. She returned to her seat, but her thoughts lingered on the trembling voice of Melania Trump, still echoing in the corners of the chamber. It was the kind of moment that, once witnessed, couldn't be unseen. And Jasmine, with all her years defending broken families in tense courtrooms, recognized its weight. Melania, now seated once more at the witness table, transformed before everyone's eyes. Shoulders back, chin up, the portrait of calm. But Jasmine knew better. She'd just seen the woman come undone, if only for a moment. "Mrs. Trump," the committee chair began, voice even and formal. "Before the break, you were discussing how politically exposed families manage the privacy of their children. Would you like to continue?" Melania's expression didn't flicker. Her voice emerged steady, rehearsed, the same public version of herself America had seen for years. "Yes," she said smoothly. "We found that limiting media exposure and being selective with school environments helped reduce external pressure." Her delivery was flawless. But Jasmine noticed the tightness near her eyes, the faint stress shadowing her otherwise composed features. She wasn't just testifying, she was acting. But Jasmine, having been backstage now, could see every missed line. Her turn to question the witness came quickly. Jasmine pushed aside her carefully prepared notes, the ones filled with data and jargon. They suddenly felt inadequate, even dishonest. "Mrs. Trump," she began, her tone careful, calibrated. "Based on your lived experience, what kinds of mental health support should be made directly available to children who find themselves overwhelmed by public scrutiny? I'm not asking about theory. I'm asking about reality. Tangible resources. Therapists, programs, interventions." There was a moment of stillness, the type that only occurs when someone is forced to step out of script. Melania looked at Jasmine, and for the first time that afternoon, seemed to genuinely consider her answer. "They need safe spaces," she said slowly, thoughtfully. "Environments where they are not judged or evaluated, where nothing they say will be reported or spun into headlines, where they're not symbols, just people." Her gaze met Jasmine's for a moment, and something unspoken passed between them. a fragile trust forming in real time. They need professionals, Melania continued, her voice gaining conviction, who understand what it means to grow up in the shadow of politics, but who have no political stake in the outcome. Jasmine leaned in, gently pressing the conversation forward. And what happens when those needs conflict with the family's political strategy or legal situation? Melania's fingers clenched around the water glass in front of her. A single beat passed. Then she said, "Then the family has to make a decision, one that not everyone will agree with." The sentence hung in the air, reverberating deeper than the room could comprehend. The rest of the hearing moved on, but the texture of the discussion had shifted. Other committee members, picking up on the deeper tension, started to ask more pointed questions. Less abstract, more practical. The room wasn't just talking policy anymore. It was touching something real. When the session ended, Jasmine didn't rush to pack up. She lingered at her desk, letting others leave first. She wasn't surprised when she noticed Melania also, staying behind. She watched the former First Lady dismiss her aide with a quiet word. Then she walked over. "Representative Crockett," Melania said, her voice now softer, lower, more guarded. "May I speak with you privately?" Jasmine nodded, standing and gesturing toward the back of the room, where the press wouldn't catch a stray photo or overheard line. Melania didn't waste time. "What you heard earlier," she began, pausing, "only briefly, I'd like to assume remains between us." Jasmine met her eyes. "Unless I believe your son is in danger, it does." "He's safe," Melania said quickly, then added, more measured. "Physically, he's with my sister in New York. He just needed space." Jasmine let that hang for a second, giving it the dignity of silence before replying. "I won't claim to understand your exact situation, but I've worked with too many families who crumbled when they prioritized appearance over healing." Melania's lips pressed into a tight line, but she didn't deflect. "It's complicated." "It always is," Jasmine replied. "But when a teenager leaves home like that, it usually means they're asking us to listen, even if it's hard." Melania's gaze drifted past Jasmine for a moment, to the wood-paneled walls, to the windows lit by the fading afternoon. "Some narratives," she said quietly, "aren't allowed to change without consequences." "I know," Jasmine said gently, "but I've never heard a parent, not one, at the end of their life say, 'I wish I'd cared more about public image than my child's peace.'" They stood in silence for a few heartbeats. It wasn't just a political divide being crossed, it was something deeper, a recognition that both women in their own ways carried burdens they couldn't speak aloud. "I wanted to say," Jasmine added, "the way you responded today, it mattered." Melania gave the smallest nod, the first crack of sincerity breaking through layers of formality. "I'll have my office contact yours," she said. "I've been thinking I might have more to offer. Perspectives, experience, maybe it could be useful." She turned, gathering her things with silent efficiency. But at the door she paused. "Representative Crockett?" she said without looking back. "Yes?" "A sanctuary, not a prison," Melania repeated softly. "That's a perspective worth remembering." Jasmine remained alone in the chamber, absorbing the words, the moment, the weight of it all. She knew that in D.C., moments like this didn't last. They didn't trend, they didn't headline. But they mattered. They always mattered. The hearing room had long since emptied, but Jasmine Crockett remained seated at her desk, alone in the echo of what had just transpired. It wasn't the kind of silence that brought calm. It was the kind that held weight. A weight that had nothing to do with politics and everything to do with the people trapped beneath its surface. Her mind replayed the earlier exchange, Melania's voice, breaking against years of restraint, the admission cloaked in diplomacy, yet undeniably raw. Jasmine didn't need any more evidence. She had lived it. She had represented mothers with tear-streaked faces trying to keep their families from falling apart. And while Melania's world was one of private jets and media filters. The pain was no different. It was universal. Later that evening, in her office lit by the amber glow of a desk lamp, Jasmine flipped through her hearing notes. But her focus wasn't on policy. It kept drifting back to that single sentence. "I promise I'll protect you. This time." A knock interrupted her thoughts. Her chief of staff, tablet in hand, entered with an expression that said everything before a word was spoken. "You're going to want to see this," he said. He handed her the device. On the screen, a breaking news alert glowed in urgent red. Barron Trump spotted at Aunt's New York residence. Former First Lady arrives for extended visit. Jasmine tapped the image. A grainy photo showed Melania stepping into a Manhattan building, her features hidden behind oversized sunglasses. Barron was not in the frame, but his name dominated the headline. She handed the tablet back without a word. But inwardly, a quiet hope took root. Maybe Melania had chosen healing over optics. Maybe, just maybe, something good was being born from that vulnerable moment caught by accident. 3 days later, as Jasmine prepared for a different committee meeting, a small package was delivered to her office. No sender name, no return label. Inside was a modest silver box. Nestled within was a bookmark, plain, elegant, made of brushed metal. Etched into its surface in a script so delicate it looked handwritten were the words, "A home should be a sanctuary, not a prison." No note, no signature. But Jasmine didn't need one. The message was loud and clear. She placed the bookmark into a dense volume of legal precedent on family law, slipping it carefully between pages on child welfare and parental obligations. A faint smile touched her lips, not out of amusement, but recognition. It was rare in Washington to receive a gesture with no angle, no PR value, no string attached. In the days that followed, her focus sharpened. Jasmine drafted new legislative language, built from everything she had witnessed in and out of court. This wasn't theoretical anymore. It had a face, a name, a voice. 2 weeks later, the committee met again to finalize proposals related to support systems for politically exposed families. Jasmine came prepared, not with her usual statistical breakdowns, but with a human-centered framework focused on confidentiality and mental health access for minors living in the shadow of political institutions. As she spoke, she avoided the melodrama that often consumed Capitol Hill. She didn't mention Melania. She didn't mention Barron. She didn't need to. Her colleagues responded not to scandal, but substance. "We speak often about national security," Jasmine said at the podium, "but we rarely talk about emotional security, especially for the children raised behind podiums, in the glare of flashbulbs and scrutiny. This measure isn't about politics, it's about protection. It's about creating space for identity, safety, and growth." The room was quiet in that rare way where respect replaces performance. The proposal passed. Unanimously. In the days after, as Jasmine resumed the fast churn of congressional duties, she noticed something unusual. Colleagues from both sides of the aisle approached her in private to express support. Some recounted stories of their own children struggling. Others simply nodded in quiet solidarity. But the most surprising feedback came from those who rarely ventured into emotional territory. They too recognized that something had shifted. Then came the photo. It was a Sunday morning. Jasmine was scrolling through her newsfeed with half a cup of coffee in hand when it appeared. An image taken in Central Park. Melania Trump walking beside Barron, not holding hands, not performing unity, just walking, close enough to speak but distant enough to respect space. The photo didn't scream reunion. It whispered something more profound: negotiation, boundaries, healing in progress. Commentators speculated as usual. Was this a public relations maneuver? A soft relaunch of the Trump family's image? But Jasmine didn't hear the noise. She noticed only the details, the relaxed tension in their shoulders, the absence of cameras in their direct path, the quiet, cautious peace that no publicist could choreograph. That same day, she opened her office bookshelf and placed the silver bookmark atop the family law volume. It had become more than a gesture. It was a commitment, a quiet promise to prioritize humanity in a city that often demanded its sacrifice. She thought about all the children like Barron, those who lived in political homes, who learned to perform before they learned to trust, who carried the weight of reputations they didn't build. And she thought about all the mothers like Melania, trapped between legacy and love, forced to choose between what looked right and what felt right. In a world obsessed with performance, Jasmine had seen something rare, a decision made not for optics but for a child. That decision would ripple outward, and she intended to make sure it did. A full month had passed since that overheard phone call in the Rayburn House hearing room, a moment that could have derailed lives had it fallen into the wrong hands. Instead, it had become the seed of something transformative. And now, standing outside a Capitol conference room, Jasmine Crockett found herself on the brink of a new collaboration she never could have predicted. She'd been summoned by the committee chair for what she assumed would be a debrief. But when she entered, her breath caught just slightly. Melania Trump stood by the tall windows, turned halfway toward the light, a portrait of composed stillness. The chair didn't hesitate. "Representative Crockett, we've invited Mrs. Trump to serve as a consultant on the family resource program you proposed. Given your background, we believe the two of you could work together on developing confidentiality standards and operational protections for the youth mental health wing." Jasmine nodded slowly, her gaze steady but intrigued. Melania said nothing at first, just watched her with eyes that, despite the calm on her face, seemed deeper, quieter, changed. "I'd be honored," Jasmine replied, keeping her voice even. What followed over the next hour was all business. The conversation turned technical, funding structures, vetting clinicians, safeguarding records from political misuse. Jasmine noticed something that surprised her. Melania wasn't merely a figurehead. She spoke with intention, clarity, and an almost fierce insistence on insulation from political influence. "Support services must exist in a separate channel," Melania said, at one point tapping her pen against the edge of her notepad. "No family member, no party official, no strategist should be able to access these records, ever." Jasmine noted the emphasis, not as a judgment, but as a signal. This was personal. When the meeting ended, most participants dispersed quickly. But Melania lingered, and so did Jasmine. They walked together down a quiet hallway lined with portraits of past legislators, frozen expressions, and forgotten bills. Jasmine spoke first. "I wasn't expecting to see you take this on." Melania's tone remained cool, but her words carried weight. "Some experiences change your understanding of what matters." They walked in silence for a few steps. Then Melania added, "Barron is returning to school soon, but we've clarified certain expectations." Jasmine didn't press for details. The statement said enough. Boundaries had been drawn, and they were being respected. "I'm glad," she said simply. When they reached the exit, Melania paused. "Your words that day about what home should mean, they made me reconsider things, not just about our situation, but about how many families must feel unable to protect their own children from the world watching." Jasmine smiled faintly. "It's a truth we rarely say aloud, but it's one every parent understands at some point." "Sometimes," Melania said quietly, "the hardest truths are the simplest ones." They parted ways there. Jasmine returned to her legislative workload, her inbox overflowing with policy questions, budget requests, and advocacy group appeals. But something in her posture had shifted, an invisible weight realigned by that unexpected alliance. Not an alliance of politics, one of protection. Weeks passed. The city churned on, news cycles, hearings, scandals. But in that quiet corner of government where real work happens, the Family Support Initiative moved forward. Its language became more refined, its provisions more protective, its mission more direct. Behind every paragraph lay the invisible influence of a woman who had once said nothing but now said enough. And then, without ceremony, Georgetown University launched a new research division. The announcement was modest. No press conference. No political figures standing behind a podium. Just a press release. New initiative on family systems and political exposure begins research phase. Jasmine's eyes lingered on the paragraph listing its advisors. Her name appeared among mental health experts and privacy scholars. Melania's did not. But Jasmine knew, she always would. The opening email came later that evening, a formal invitation to join the advisory board, followed by a handwritten note, unsigned, creating sanctuary through understanding. She accepted. Months passed. The program took shape. Confidential mental health services for the children of political figures were piloted. Staff were trained. Schools near D.C. received resource kits. A quiet infrastructure of care began to take hold, one designed not to fix headlines, but to prevent breakdowns. And then, a year after it all began, Jasmine found herself attending a panel on youth privacy at a national summit. The keynote speakers? Barron Trump and Melania Trump. Their names were on the schedule. But it was seeing them in person, mother and son, walking together into the room, that struck Jasmine most. They weren't clinging to one another. They weren't performing connection. They were simply there, together, equal in presence. Melania introduced her son, then stepped aside. Barron approached the podium with calm steps, tall now, more assured, but still carrying the careful weight of someone who knew what the world could take from him. His voice was measured, academic, yet warm. Our research focuses on identity, development under public exposure, he said, and how the psychological need for privacy often collides with the pressures of legacy and expectation. He never referenced himself, not once. But Jasmine, seated in the third row, heard everything between the lines. When the panel ended, and the room dispersed into mingling groups and soft applause, Jasmine felt a light touch on her shoulder. Representative Crockett, Melania said. But this time there was warmth behind the formality. Your discussion points were insightful, she added. Thank you. And congratulations, Jasmine replied, glancing toward Barron. You've both come a long way. Melania's gaze shifted toward her son, her voice softer now. We had help, and we listened when it mattered. Jasmine nodded, content to let the words settle. And then, for the second time in their unusual history, Melania reached out, not with power, not with politics, but with shared purpose. Sanctuary, she whispered. It was always the right word. Jasmine smiled. And now it's policy. The conference hall buzzed with post-panel chatter, filled with dignitaries, policy wonks, and mental health professionals. Jasmine Crockett lingered near the refreshment table, quietly sipping water, her mind still anchored in the moment she had just witnessed. Barron Trump, once the most shielded teenager in America, had stood before a national audience and spoken, not as a political heir, but as a young man shaped by public scrutiny, now choosing to shape the conversation around it. Jasmine had listened closely to his insights, his avoidance of personal anecdote, his reliance on research language. But behind his carefully chosen words, she heard the echoes of what had started a year ago in that empty hearing room. The tremble in Melania's voice, the desperation, the silent pact that followed. Later that evening, Jasmine returned to her office to find a small, flat package waiting on her desk. Inside was a hardcover book, Privacy and Identity Development in Adolescence. Tucked beneath the front cover was a simple note card, cream-colored, thick, unlined. Just 2 hand-printed initials marked it. BT. She ran a finger along the embossed spine of the book. It wasn't a gift. It was a signal, a continuation of the conversation they had never had out loud. The next week brought another moment of quiet significance. As Jasmine reviewed an upcoming witness list for a digital privacy hearing, her eyes stopped on a familiar name. Melania Trump, Consultant, Youth Digital Sanctuary Foundation. Not former First Lady. Not political spouse. Just a title that reflected substance. Attached to the briefing material was the Foundation's mission statement. Jasmine scanned the document until her eyes landed on a line that felt almost too perfectly familiar. Our mission is to create digital and emotional sanctuary for young people in an age of hyper-exposure. She didn't smile. Not outwardly, but internally, she nodded in approval. The language was unmistakably born of something deeper than policy. It had been lived. 6 months later, Georgetown University quietly announced a full research initiative. It would be directed by a promising young scholar whose name, intentionally or not, was absent from the media packet. But Jasmine didn't need the byline. The stated goal said it all: to develop protocols protecting the mental and emotional well-being of children in politically exposed families. Then, almost ceremonially, a sealed envelope arrived at Jasmine's office. Inside was a formal letter from the university inviting her to serve on the advisory board. Below the official text in small handwriting was a single line: creating sanctuary through understanding. She didn't need to ask who had written it. She accepted immediately. Time moved on, as it always does in Washington. Bills changed names. Committees reshuffled. But this initiative, this small corner of sanctuary built from an overheard plea and a compassionate choice, grew roots. And then, a year to the day since that first hearing, Jasmine sat in the audience of another public gathering. This one wasn't held in the Rayburn building or a hotel ballroom. It was on the Georgetown campus in a modest lecture hall. The speaker was Barron Trump, now older, visibly more confident, but still unmistakably careful with himself. He stood beneath soft stage lighting, delivering his presentation on the psychological toll of involuntary public identity. He spoke of research findings, brain development stages, privacy thresholds, but he never once said my family or my name. Still, the truth hummed beneath every sentence. Jasmine listened closely, not just to what he said, but how he said it. He wasn't seeking validation or applause. He was building something, out of experience, out of restraint, out of intention. When the event concluded, Jasmine approached the reception area. Melania stood nearby, speaking quietly to another attendee, but broke away as Jasmine neared. "We meet again," she said with a hint of weariness and something softer: ease. "It's becoming a tradition," Jasmine replied. They spoke briefly about the Foundation's progress, how the research had informed policy discussions across several states, how schools were integrating the findings into their student support programs. Barron joined them, holding a tablet still open to his notes. He looked between the two women with polite reserve, but Jasmine could see the shift. He wasn't shielding himself anymore. He was engaging, on his terms. "We were just discussing the legislative frameworks that enabled the initiative," Melania said, her tone one of subtle gratitude. Barron nodded. "Those early protections helped us define the research boundaries." The moment was quiet, respectful, professional, but it also felt like closure. As they prepared to leave, Melania lightly touched Jasmine's arm. "Sanctuary," she said again. One word, heavy with memory. "Always the goal," Jasmine answered, her voice steady. They parted once more, not as symbols of opposite worlds, but as collaborators who had found common ground in a place where it was rarely found: the private terrain of public children. That night, Jasmine returned to her apartment and placed the book from Barron back on her bookshelf. She looked at the silver bookmark still nestled in her legal volume. The words etched. There had now become something more than sentiment. They were structure, policy, change. A home should be a sanctuary, not a prison. Washington had 1,000 stories running at any given time. But this one, the quiet one that never made headlines, had become a revolution of its own, and it wasn't finished yet. 2 years had passed since Jasmine Crockett had sat alone in the Rayburn hearing room, listening to a voice she wasn't meant to hear. What had begun as an accidental breach of privacy had quietly reshaped how Capitol Hill viewed one of its most overlooked responsibilities: protecting the children behind the podiums, behind the headlines, behind the power. Now standing before the newly opened Youth Privacy Advocacy Center at Georgetown University, Jasmine paused beneath its stone archway. The air was cool, the sun filtered through trees, and a modest plaque by the entrance bore the center's mission: to protect the developing identities of youth exposed to public scrutiny. She was early for the ribbon-cutting ceremony, and she didn't mind. The quiet reminded her of why this mattered. Inside, the atmosphere buzzed with energy. Researchers, students, policymakers, and child advocates mingled across the modern space, their conversations blending into a steady hum of excitement and idealism. But Jasmine's attention was elsewhere. She had just seen Melania Trump enter. They hadn't spoken in months. Not since the last advisory board meeting. But there was no tension between them, just an unspoken understanding that their connection no longer required constant affirmation. It had become its own architecture. Melania joined her near the program table. Her style, as always, was flawless, but her presence felt different now, less like someone performing calm and more like someone who had earned it. "He's doing well," she said softly, almost before Jasmine could ask. There was no need for clarification. Of course she meant Barron. "He finishes his doctorate this spring," Melania continued, "and he lives on his own now, but still comes for dinner, every Sunday." The detail was ordinary, even mundane, but Jasmine heard its full meaning. After all the public storms, all the hidden negotiations, this was peace reclaimed. "On their terms, I'm happy to hear that," Jasmine replied, meaning every word. Melania nodded once, but her expression turned serious. "That legislation you're sponsoring, the expansion on digital privacy protections for minors and political families, it's important. It's moving through committee next week," Jasmine confirmed. "We're seeing bipartisan traction." There was a pause, just long enough for the memory to surface. "You know," Melania said, her voice barely audible, "when he left that night, I thought it was over. I thought I'd lost him. But he wasn't running from me. He was running from what our home had become." Jasmine didn't interrupt. "I kept trying to preserve a picture," Melania continued. "But the truth was, it was hurting him. He didn't need perfection. He needed protection. The kind that wasn't about public image." Jasmine said quietly, "He needed sanctuary." Melania's gaze didn't waver. "Exactly." The ceremony began then, and both women turned their attention to the stage. Barron Trump was introduced first, not as a former president's son, but as the director of the center's founding research initiative. He stepped up to the microphone, clean-cut, calm, his posture no longer cautious but collected. His words were crisp, grounded in data and experience. He spoke of identity formation, of trauma responses, of the long-term consequences of privacy invasion on youth development. But nowhere in his remarks was there self-pity or illusion. His message was forward-facing, constructive. "Sanctuary," Barron said midway through his speech, "is not just a physical space. It's the psychological assurance that one's truth will not be commodified, that vulnerability won't be repackaged for public consumption." Jasmine saw Melania's shoulders shift beside her, not in discomfort but in something like pride. When the presentation concluded, the applause was loud but not theatrical. It was respect, not for name, but for voice. As the crowd began to move toward the reception, Jasmine stepped aside to review her notes for a call she had scheduled later that evening. That's when Barron approached her. "Representative Crockett," he said, offering his hand. She shook it, noting how much had changed in the boy she had once seen through the crack in a hearing room's mask. "Or should I say, chairwoman now?" he added with a polite smile. "Jasmine is fine," she replied, amused. "Congratulations. The center is remarkable." "Thank you. It wouldn't exist without your early work, or without that day," he said, pausing deliberately, "when everything began to shift." Jasmine offered no denial. There was no need for either of them to pretend they didn't know what he meant. "That phone call," Barron said quietly, his gaze direct, "changed everything. My mother told me what happened, what you could have done with it and what you didn't." Jasmine didn't look away. "It wasn't mine to use." He nodded slowly. That kind of restraint, it's rare, especially here. Some things deserve protection regardless of politics, she said. Barron gestured around them to the space now filled with students, educators, and policy advocates. That philosophy is what built this. They were soon joined by Melania, who slipped into the conversation with her signature grace. "I see you found each other," she said, almost teasing. "We were discussing foundations, philosophical and otherwise," Barron replied. Melania's smile deepened. Sanctuary and authenticity, the recurring themes. For a moment, the three stood in comfortable silence, no roles to perform, just mutual recognition. As Jasmine prepared to leave, Barron touched her arm gently. "There's something I've always wanted to say. Thank you for not using what you heard that day as a weapon, for choosing compassion over advantage." She looked at him with sincerity. That choice didn't feel heroic. It just felt human. Barron nodded. "We're trying to institutionalize that principle here. That protection should never be political." As Jasmine stepped outside into the crisp air, she glanced back once more at the center's entrance. Two figures stood just inside, mother and son. Their silhouettes were no longer distant, no longer fractured. They weren't performing reconciliation. They were simply sharing space, secure in their bond. And in Jasmine's mind, one truth rang louder than ever. Sanctuary isn't granted. It's chosen. Jasmine Crockett stepped into her office just as the city lights began to glow across the DC skyline. She loosened her coat and placed her notes from the Youth Privacy Advocacy Center opening on her desk. But even as she moved through the usual motions of winding down, her thoughts lingered on the conversation with Barron, his clarity, his restraint, and that look in his eyes when he said thank you. Some choices aren't dramatic. Some don't come with applause or viral moments. But they change lives quietly. She poured herself a glass of water, walked to the window and stared out at the Capitol dome shining under the night sky. The building looked timeless, but Jasmine knew better. It evolved with every quiet act of courage. Every piece of legislation passed without fanfare. Every human decision made behind closed doors. That evening, her staff informed her of a delivery. Another package, small, weighted. Inside, a crystal paperweight, engraved on its surface, was the same image used in the center's logo, a simple open door with light beaming through. Alongside it, a note, "Sanctuary over appearance." There was no name. But Jasmine didn't need one. The meaning was unmistakable. She placed the crystal on her desk, where morning sunlight would catch it each day. It became more than a paperweight. It was a compass, a reminder that the work she was doing, however quiet, was anchoring real change in lives that had once been measured only by how visible they were. In the days that followed, Jasmine kept working. She introduced new amendments to the privacy legislation now moving through Congress. She drafted language to ensure young people and political families could access mental health resources without parental gatekeeping, when doing so could cause harm. She fought for funding allocations that would extend those protections beyond DC to state capitals, where the spotlight burned just as bright and just as cruel, and the crystal stayed right where it belonged. News coverage of the center's launch was modest, focused on budget projections and implementation schedules. Few headlines mentioned the unusual alliance that had birthed the program. Jasmine didn't mind. In fact, she preferred it that way. Some truths didn't need to be shouted to be powerful. In the weeks that followed, she met with school counselors, digital privacy scholars, and policy advocates to refine the legislative roadmap. But always, she returned to the human side of the issue. The kids who had to smile on stage while their families fractured behind closed doors. The young adults who didn't know if their secrets would become scandals. And then came the moment she hadn't expected. Barron Trump asked for a private meeting. No media, no aides, just him. He arrived at her office in the early evening, wearing a dark coat and carrying a leather folder. Taller than most young men his age, he moved with quiet deliberation. like someone used to being observed and now choosing what parts of himself to reveal. "Representative Crockett," he greeted, his voice composed but sincere. "Barron," she acknowledged. "Come in." He settled into the chair opposite her desk. She noticed how his hands folded over the folder, a gesture that blended nervousness with preparation. "My mother told me about the early stages of this work," he began. "But I want to contribute now, actively, not just as a figure, but as a researcher." Jasmine nodded, her curiosity piqued. "I'm working on a long-term project," he continued. "A longitudinal study on identity development in politically exposed children. Georgetown's sponsoring it, but I want the framework to reflect the real risks." She leaned forward, interested. "What kind of risks?" Barron didn't hesitate. "Coerced compliance, emotional suppression, surveillance masquerading as concern, parental agendas masking political strategy." His words landed with the force of lived experience, wrapped in academic restraint. "I want to design protocols that protect a young person's right to exist outside of their family's narrative," he said, "even if their last name is on campaign signs." Jasmine didn't respond immediately. She let the depth of his intent settle. She could see it. He wasn't coming to heal anymore. He was coming to build. "I'd like to review your research outline," she said finally, "and bring in some legal perspectives to ensure its recommendations can transition into policy." His shoulders eased slightly, the first layer of tension peeling back. "Thank you," he said. "I wasn't sure if what?" She prompted gently. "If what happened in that hearing room would always define how you saw me," he admitted. Jasmine shook her head. "It never defined you. It reminded me why we do this." He looked away for a moment, then back. "I've never forgotten that you didn't speak when you could have." "Some truths don't belong to me," she said. Barron gave a small nod. "That kind of boundary is rare in this city." When he left, she held his research proposal in her hand, over 50 pages long, dense with references, ethical frameworks, and real-world application. But what struck her most was the handwritten line on the inside cover, "For every child forced to perform, may you find space to breathe." Jasmine placed the proposal beside the crystal on her desk. She sat back in her chair and exhaled. The story wasn't over, but it had turned into something far more than anyone had expected. From a single overheard phone call had grown a national initiative, a research program, a piece of legislation, and perhaps most importantly, a young man now using his voice, not to break silence, but to shape space for others to speak. 5 years had passed since that private phone call accidentally spilled into public space, and Jasmine Crockett stood once more beneath the marble arches of Georgetown University. This time, it was for the grand opening of a new wing of the Youth Privacy Advocacy Center, an expansion dedicated to research, outreach, and global partnerships. What had begun with a moment of raw vulnerability was now, unmistakably, a movement. She was escorted to her seat near the front, her name engraved on a small brass plaque. To her left, Melania Trump. To her right, Dr. Barron Trump. That title, Doctor, had taken years of quiet, disciplined work, and yet it felt only natural now. The young man who once hesitated to speak in his own name now commanded rooms with precision and calm. His voice no longer caught between fear and duty, but settled into purpose. Before the program began, Melania leaned slightly toward Jasmine. "He's doing well," she said. "Really well." Jasmine looked over and offered a warm nod. "I never doubted he would be." "He has his own place now," Melania added, "but he still comes over every Sunday for dinner." It was a small thing, but Jasmine understood its gravity. In a family that once felt fractured by public expectation, this was the proof of healing, not in grand gestures but in consistent connection. "And you?" Jasmine asked softly. Melania smiled faintly. "I live quieter now, still involved, but I pick my causes carefully." Jasmine glanced at the schedule of speakers for the day. Melania's name appeared third. "This cause chose you, I think." Melania's expression didn't change, but something flickered in her eyes. Maybe it did. As the ceremony began, speakers from around the world took the podium, each reiterating the need for privacy protections in an age where everything was broadcast. But it wasn't until Barron walked onto the stage that the energy in the room shifted. He spoke of adolescence as a crucible, how visibility could distort self-perception, how silence often came not from passivity, but protection. He detailed findings from the center's latest study, linking prolonged media exposure in political families with measurable developmental impacts. But it was when he pivoted to the human side of his research that the room fell utterly still. Sanctuary, he said clearly, is more than a right. It's a need. And sometimes the first step toward building it is recognizing who never had it. Jasmine watched as Melania's posture remained composed, but her hands, resting in her lap, clasped tighter. He hadn't mentioned her. He didn't need to. The room understood. After the panel concluded, as guests gathered in the adjacent gallery for the reception, Jasmine found herself approached by both Trump's mother and son. They stood before her not as public figures, not even as collaborators, but as family, healed in ways that policy alone could never accomplish. Barron spoke first. I wanted you to know that the center's newest fellowship is named after your bill, the Crockett Grant, for students studying youth privacy and public identity. Jasmine's eyes widened, touched. That's an honor. Thank you. Melania nodded toward her son. It was his idea. Barron smiled. We've built policy. Now we need people to carry it forward. They spent a few minutes discussing the new program, the rising interest from other universities, and the growing list of young scholars entering the field. But as the conversation began to wind down, Barron paused. There's something I've been meaning to say, he said, his voice lower now, more personal. That day, when my mother called me during the hearing, I was at a breaking point. I couldn't keep pretending, and when she told me later what happened, how you heard everything, I assumed the worst. Jasmine stayed silent, giving him space. But you didn't use it. You protected it, he said. In a city that often rewards betrayal, you chose discretion. That changed how I saw the system, and it gave me a reason to believe change was possible. Melania stepped closer. And I need you to know, I never forgot your words either. Sanctuary, not prison. I used to think protecting a child meant shielding them. Now I know it means letting them breathe. Jasmine's throat tightened slightly, but her tone remained steady. You both did the hard work. I just happened to be standing close enough to see the moment the story could have gone either way. Barron extended his hand, not as a farewell, but a gesture of respect. Some stories never make the news, he said, but they still write history. Jasmine shook his hand, then turned to Melania. What you've both done here, it's more than legislation. It's legacy. Later that night, Jasmine returned to her office. She passed the crystal paperweight still sitting beneath the window, its engraving catching the glow of the Capitol dome, sanctuary over appearance. She thought back to all that had unfolded from one overheard conversation, a cascade of decisions, quiet acts of courage, trust formed across impossible lines. And now, it had become something permanent. The next morning, her team briefed her on upcoming votes, committee scheduling, and a new wave of support letters from advocacy groups across the country. One of the notes came handwritten from a young woman in California studying political psychology. It ended with a single line. This fellowship changed my life. Thank you for protecting stories like ours. Jasmine looked out the window and smiled. In a world where so many chose performance, she had chosen protection, and that had made all the difference.